Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorian. Now, what sorts of weapons would people actually use in a fantasy environment? That is the sort of fantasy that you're probably familiar with things like dragons and giants and orcs and dwarves and elves and these kinds of things. And the fact is that we have received a lot of sort of second-hand wisdom about what sorts of weapons and armour might be used in this sort of environment because of the typical Tolkien-esque sort of fantasy world that is based on, fundamentally, medieval Europe. But actually, if we put some of those creatures into the real world, if we typically encountered orcs, or you typically encountered giants or sorts of monsters, you know, like trolls and dragons and things like this, would you actually find typical medieval weapons like this longsword here in that world? Well, I actually think not. So let's have a little look at what I think we would actually encounter in a world inhabited by creatures like that. This video comes free of other adverts thanks to Raid Shadow Legends, which is a turn-based RPG combat game. Raid Shadow Legends is a hugely popular game. It's free to play on PC or your phone. You can download from my link below. Raid has a very strong focus on character development and advancement, and as well as hundreds of characters to unlock, it's also got 16 factions such as Orcs, Sacred Order, High Elves and so on. My favourite faction is the Sacred Order. Perhaps not that surprising, they're kind of knights. They're a bit like sort of paladins, I suppose. So my favourite faction is the Sacred Order if we go in there. And you can see these are all of the characters that you can collect. The ones that are highlighted are the ones that I've already got. This is my favourite dude. He's got really tough armour. I've added loads of upgraded equipment to him. He's strong in attack, strong in defence. Now you've got the faction wars, and in each of these you can only fight with one faction. Once you specialise in a faction and gather enough characters for it, you can actually unlock special missions just for that faction. Challenge yourself to your edge in the ongoing tournaments. Compete against the entire Raid community while fighting the Spider's Den, Ice Golem's Peak, the Almighty Fire Knight or the Notorious Dragon in order to win awesome rewards and rare artifacts. Go to the video description below, click on my special links there, and if you're a new player, you'll get 100,000 silver plus 50 gems plus 1 energy refill and 1 free champion called the Adjudicator, which is a really good champion for beginners. You can access your rewards up here in the treasure box. These rewards are only available for the next 30 days and only for new players. You can find me online and fight me, and I use the name Captain Context, of course. Good luck and see you there. So thanks a lot for staying with me and your patience. Now back to the main topic of this video, and that is what weapons would actually be used in a fantasy world inhabited by the sorts of creatures that we read in fantasy books, or you see in role-playing games, or we even see in things like kind of Lord of the Rings and fantasy, you know, Dragon Slayer and things like this. Fantasy films with these types of creatures that we're familiar with. Well, one of the problems here is we're so familiar with this sort of environment that we don't necessarily question some of the logic of some of the weapons that characters actually have. Now, the basic premise that I want to start out with here is that for intelligent life to have got to a certain point of civilization, they would have had to have survived the non-intelligent life inhabiting that world. So, for example, if our own world, if large dinosaurs had survived, then for our mammal ancestors to have evolved to a point where we would actually survive and become intelligent and actually start living in communities and creating buildings and doing farming and stuff like this, we would have had to have positioned ourselves in a place whereby we were, in terms of our armament, fundamentally, in our self-defense, we were superior to the natural creatures living in that world. And this is of course true of a fantasy world as well, of course, whether it be dinosaurs in our world, or whether it be things like dragons and trolls and ogres and giants, and you know, manticores and griffins and everything else in a fantasy world. You have to have weapons that are able to deal with those creatures. So even if we look at the real world, if you go to, you know, a part of South America or a part of Africa where there are some challenging animals to deal with, if you're living a fairly hand-to-mouth existence, if you're living in the jungle or you're living on the savannah, the plains, whatever, you need to be able to fend off those creatures, whatever those creatures are, potentially hunt them as well. So if they're large herbivorous creatures that you want to eat, you know, if we were dealing with a dinosaur type of world where you had, you know, brachiosaurs or diplodocuses that you wanted to kill, you would need weapons that were able to do that. So the fundamental point and perspective that I really want to come at this from is that before you develop weapons for fighting other humans, the humans first have to be able to survive the creatures that they're pitted against. Now, a fantasy world is even more complex than that, because not only do you have animals and monsters to deal with, but you also have other intelligent species as well, who themselves would have had to have survived to a point where they had actually developed societies and cultures. So if you're contending with orcs and goblins, and if you're a human, then potentially dwarves and elves and these other potential opponents or rivals, the likelihood is that the bands of humans would actually band together, because they're in a world where you have a common enemy. If the common enemy is orcs, for example, it is unlikely that you would get so much conflict between the humans. You know, if I can make the Independence Day analogy here, but if aliens attacked Earth, I suspect that you'd find that a lot of the wars between different factions of humans would suddenly stop, and everyone would focus their attentions on fighting the aliens, because now you have a common enemy. And in a typical Tolkien-esque kind of fantasy world, this is exactly what you have. You have these common enemies. You have people like orcs and goblins, or orcs and goblins to contend with, so the humans will probably band together. So their weapons wouldn't be optimized for fighting other humans as they are in our world. They'd be optimized for fighting against those creatures. But what difference does that actually make to the weapons? Well, quite simply, weapons that have evolved in our world, in reality, like longswords or things like this katana. It's actually a fairly large katana, katana, or indeed, you know, later period swords like this spadroon, or we could look at rapiers or small swords. One-handed swords like arming swords, falchions, whatever, they are optimized for fighting against other humans, and a lot of the time on this channel is devoted to trying to understand why certain weapons developed the way they did. What particular context is that weapon evolved to perform best in, or in some cases not perform very well in. But fundamentally, weapons are a product of their environment. Now, if humans, for example, if their main enemies were orcs, let's fixate on orcs for a second. So let's make some assumptions about what orcs are. Now, some people, I realise some fantasy environments might have orcs modelled slightly differently, but if we take the kind of Warhammer version of orcs, so they're bigger and stronger than humans, they've got tougher bodies, they can sustain more damage. It's more difficult to do damage to their bodies because they're bigger and more muscular. They have, you know, to get to their internal organs, you have to go further into their body, quite simply. Their skin is probably tougher, more leathery, like certain types of animal, maybe almost like, if not quite hippo or rhino hide, certainly tougher than human skin. And they're able to theoretically wear more armour or heavier armour because they've got bigger, stronger bodies as well. So if you're fighting against orcs, you're probably going to find that something like a simple old longsword, which does absolutely fine in a medieval European environment against medieval human opponents, whether they're in armour or out of armour, this type of weapon might just not cut the mustard against orcs. So what probably would humans have to use against orcs? Well, my suggestion would be things more like this. We might see that rather than the Dane axe here, or great axe, being a very specialised weapon in the Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Norman era, you might find that this is actually a very normal weapon in a fantasy environment where your opponents are mostly orcs. You're not fighting many other humans, you're fighting other orcs, or fighting orcs as a human. And doing that, you might find that these sorts of weapons, like this great axe, or indeed spears with particularly large heads designed to incapacitate and do more wounding damage to large creatures like orcs, strong creatures like orcs, or indeed like the Zweihander behind me here, you might find that swords like this suddenly become normal. Rather than being unusual in medieval Europe, Big swords like this, if you're fighting against bigger, stronger, tougher creatures, might just be the normal type of sword. You might find that smaller types of swords don't really have a place, or that at most they're used as backup weapons like a dagger. So I think the first thing is that if you're dealing with a fantasy environment where there are a lot of very large and tough creatures, you would find a greater use of big two-handed weapons. Also, potentially, because the shield, for example, which was throughout human history on Earth, the shield coupled with the spear or coupled with types of swords has predominated, and one of the reasons for that is against missile weapons. If you're predominantly fighting against opponents who don't use a lot of missile weapons, I'm not saying that fantasy orcs, that they fit into that category, but if you're fighting against creatures and monsters who don't operate more complex weapons, or perhaps don't even operate weapons at all, in case of kind of animals, then you might find that shields don't have a place, and if you're not using shields, you may as well use the biggest, most powerful two-handed sword that you can. So rather than little one-handed swords being normal, used with a shield, you might find that pretty much all swords are massive in that environment. You may even find that some of the biggest weapons that have been used in our world, in our history, have to be even bigger. You know, things like bardishes with very long blades. You might find that if you're having to deal with rhino size and strength and toughness creatures on a regular basis, then you might find that your axes, for example, become ludicrously huge. You don't need to be able to move them quickly. A Dane axe, despite the fact that it looks pretty big, is pretty quick and nimble to move around. But you might find that you don't need to be so quick and nimble with your weapon if you're fighting against certain types of creatures. What you might want to be doing is just have literally the heaviest, biggest, hardest hitting weapon you can possibly handle. That's one way of looking at this. The other way is that you might find that the shapes of certain weapons change. You might find that spearheads, for example, become very long and thin, so that you can penetrate through thick hide as deep into the animal as possible. You find sort of suggestion of this with Maasai spears, for example. If you look at Maasai spears, they're very different to spears from most of the rest of Africa. They were used for lion hunting, and killing, lion hunting was seen very much as a part of their culture, of that's how you enter manhood. And they have different ends on them for different purposes. One end is used for hunting, one end is used for fighting, more or less. So you might find that weapons evolve different shapes that we're not familiar with. They also might develop in bigger sizes. They potentially, now here's a wacky thought, some weapons might even be developed not to be used by a single person, but to be used by groups of people, but against single opponents. So people always look at defeating something like a dragon, something dragon-sized. You could imagine a dinosaur if you want something a little bit more plausible to the real world. But if people were trying to kill a brachiosaur or triceratops or something like this, then potentially you might be looking at spears which are not held by an individual, or axes which are not operated by an individual, but are actually gripped by a couple of people operating in unison. So a spear is perhaps easier to kind of imagine this being done with, but you might find gigantic spears being deployed, almost like a battering ram, with a group of people holding onto them and operating them together. Equally, missile weapons. So if you're dealing with very tough or very big opponents, you might find different types of missile weapons start to become more popular. So if we look at the Roman ballista or scorpion, then you might find certain types of crossbow like this. They've got a slower rate of fire, but they're very, very powerful. So almost somewhere between the sorts of machines you see used on ships and in siege warfare and what we'd usually imagine as an individual weapon. And again, it all depends on, in any given environment, what your opponents are. So the other thing to bear in mind is if you're designing a fantasy environment for a book or role-playing game or whatever, the weapons that a certain culture chooses in one area will be a product of what their opponents or their prey are, or threats are, in that area. So if, for example, if you know the Forgotten Realms environment, if you're dealing with somewhere like Chult, where there are dinosaurs to be hunted, there are many ways, obviously, that you could hunt dinosaurs. You could dig large pits, or you could do like the Native Americans did with buffalo herds and drive them off the edge of cliffs and things like this. Mammoths, some evidence that mammoths were killed that way. Or you could actually take them out with weapons, so large-scale crossbows, perhaps basically crude weapons, as in they have a crew to operate them, or indeed large spears and things like this, specialized weapons that. But in another environment, you might find that your opponents aren't particularly big or tough. They might be lots of little goblins. So if you're a human tribe living in an area that is infested with goblins or kobolds or whatever, they might be really weak and puny. But there are numerous. They might outnumber you greatly, and that might bring in a completely different style of combat. You might find that, for example, missile weapons don't work very effectively against them because there are so many of them, and because you can't get a high enough rate of fire unless you're Lars Anderson with a bow. Then you might find that, for example, bows are not so useful against massed wave after wave of kobolds, because unlike with a Maxim machine gun or a Gardner machine gun, you just can't get the rate of fire to kill the enemy quick enough before being swarmed by them. So you might find that in that situation you might have war wagons, for example. War wagons might evolve to form into lagers, like we see first in kind of 14th, 15th century Central Europe, what's now the Czech Republic, and later on we see it again against the Zulus in South Africa. So there could be whole different ways of combating the opponents you're dealing with, based on whether you're hunting, whether they're things that are trying to hunt you, or based on whether they are more kind of intelligent, kind of cultured, shall we say, opponents like orcs or goblins might be, and what their physiology is. And of course, we have to admit that in some situations these historical weapons would serve well enough if you're dealing with a mixture of opponents. So if your opponent might be elves, might be dwarves, might be goblins, might be orcs, then indeed some of these conventional swords, as we're used to seeing, copied from history really in a fantasy environment, might make sense. But there might be subtle differences. So if some of your opponents are going to be tougher than humans are, so in our world we only really have to deal with humans, don't we? They might be armoured, they might be unarmoured, but whatever. But if you might have to face humans, you might have to face elves, which are very similar to humans in physiology, or you might have to fight trolls and ogres and things like this, you might find that swords have a tendency to be subtly different. They might be a bit broader, they might be a bit heavier, they might be a bit bigger than usual, because fighting a human opponent in a duel is no longer really on your radar. You're more likely to have to defend yourself from a bunch of ogres on a road trying to basically rob your stuff from you. So your weapons might be completely different in that regard. Finally, I want to throw in another thing. I do suspect, as well as the kind of weapons operated by more than one person, and particularly large weapons, I think there's another, and missile weapons, perhaps with a slower rate of fire but with a higher energy to them, like very powerful crossbows and things like ballista and things like that. We're not even going to mention gunpowder here, incidentally. I think there's another category of weapons which within fantasy games and books and movies get slightly overlooked, and that is poison weapons. And usually poison weapons in our world are used against small creatures in a hunting application. But potentially, if you're having to deal with very large creatures or creatures which are difficult to take out through conventional wounding means, it might be possible that if you had access to particularly potent types of poison, that they, especially if it's a this is just to kill a creature, you're not going to eat it afterwards. It might be that poisons start to play a part if you have access to them. So I hope there's some thoughts. I think fundamentally one of the problems I have with weapons in fantasy in general is that in a world which is rich in fantasy creatures, most of those creatures are bigger and stronger, or at least a lot of those creatures are bigger and stronger than humans are. And that is going to have a huge knock-on effect on the weapons that would be used. Generally speaking, and let's face it, this is actually correct to most fantasy, wargaming or role-playing games. The weapons generally, I think, would be bigger and heavier if most of your opponents are going to be bigger and heavier and tougher than you are. But I think aside from that, I think there's a little bit of over-reliance by fantasy designers of fantasy worlds on relying on traditional designs of sword and other weapons, spear and axe, that come from our history. You know, when you look at Forgotten Realms, you see people with rapiers, you see people with sabres, you know, katanas, longswords, the typical swords that we get in our world. And I don't think that you would, in a world which was so heavily inhabited by other species, both intelligent and animal-like, that you very often might encounter. I don't think the weapons would be as familiar as fantasy world creators usually make them. I think they would be different sorts of designs than, or certainly in different proportions than we usually see. I think there would be a bigger emphasis on things like cleavers, S-stocks, things which do a large amount of damage, either cutting or thrusting or chopping. But in some cases, you know, you've got to bear in mind, I always make this big point about you need sidearms and main weapons. A weapon you can carry in your hand is great. You do also need sidearms, but I think we'd see differences in the sidearms as well. Anyway, something to think about. I would say that the takeaway message here is focus on exactly, if you're creating a culture, who is that culture's threat? Either what do they kill or what tries to kill them? And what is the physiology of their opponents, and what sorts of weapons would evolve to deal with the physiology of their main opponents or their main variety of opponents. Thanks for watching. Check out the links below, as I mentioned earlier, and I will see you really soon again. Give us a like and a subscribe. I'll see you really soon again for another video on Schola Gladiatora channel. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.